Hype is a double-edged sword, sometimes allowing lesser-known games to gain popularity, but just as often creating unrealistic expectations for titles that end up getting too much of the spotlight shone on them. Oftentimes, even if players try to temper their expectations, they're almost not allowed to, as an endless stream of trailers and promotions do their best to get the public excited about what's new and upcoming. As more and more games come out and marketing budgets go through the roof, there are so many games that end up getting released to less than stellar reception that we just couldn't cover all of them in a single list, so we're back to take a look at even more of them once again. As in our previous video on this subject, just because a game is disappointing doesn't necessarily mean that it was terrible overall. It simply means that people expected something different from the product they actually ended up getting, and most people who played it at launch felt massively let down, and sometimes downright lied to. Is that clear? Okay then, let's go. I'm Peter from TripleJump, and here are 10 more of the most disappointing video games of all time. Number 10. Too Human. When a game is in development hell long enough to jump from platform to platform, many aspects are bound to get changed and adapted in an effort to bring the experience up to par with others on the same technology. Too Human is just one such game that eventually escaped from purgatory, but seemingly needn't have bothered. The initial concept was intriguing: Norse gods taking the form of cybernetically enhanced humans to help protect the world from threats, and for the most part, people were excited to see what this could offer, at least at first. However, as the game remained in development for years, interest waned, especially after some of the later trailers featured unoptimized and choppy gameplay. Folks were right to be worried, as when the game finally did launch after 10 years, the experience was rough on a technical level, the combat was clunky and repetitive, and the story wasn't as strong as it should have been. Developer Silicon Knights also ended up getting into an incredibly messy legal battle with Epic Games, which did nothing but turn people off from the studio. This mess unsurprisingly killed the planned trilogy and saw the game pulled from the Xbox Store, with an order for all of the remaining physical copies to be destroyed, ultimately making Too Human a disappointment for anyone who was involved in making it as well. Number 9. Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts. While the series has been dormant for quite some time now, at least at time of recording, but it is Summer Game Fest coming up, so I'm sure we're going to see a new Banjo game revealed there. I can dream, can't I? The bird and bear team that is Banjo-Kazooie is still an icon of platform games to this day. After Banjo-Tooie and its tease for another sequel, fans simply couldn't contain their excitement when a trailer for another installment came out and proved that the duo wasn't done yet. This third game that everyone got, however, was Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts, and it ended up being very divisive, to say the least. Some found that the game rejuvenated the series in an interesting way, and many praised the innovation. But arguably, more folks were let down by how different the game was from the others, and found the vehicles were too unwieldy to maneuver, and that as a whole, the game needed just a little bit more polish. Many also had the opinion that the addition of Banjo and Kazooie to this project did nothing but hurt it, and that it would have been received much better if it had simply been something altogether separate. Weirdly, similar building mechanics have been used in the years since Nuts and Bolts' release and been popular parts of their respective games, so maybe the biggest disappointment with this title is that it was simply too far ahead of its time. Number 8. Redfall. The most recent of the games on this list, Redfall, sounds like it could be a fantastic experience, at least on paper. A co-op shooter from Arcane Studios that centers around fighting swarms of vampires? Oh, sounds too good to be true. It turns out though that that's exactly what it happened to be, because when the game finally launched in May 2023, it was not at all up to the quality people were expecting from the seasoned studio. As is the case all too often recently, the game was not nearly as polished as it should have been, with many finding it to be bland, repetitive, and glitchy, especially when it came to the AI, as the supposedly intimidating vampire threat would often drift around aimlessly, completely ignoring players. Another issue was that if players did opt to play in co-op, only the host would save progression through the story, meaning if anyone did duck out and want to pick the story back up, they may very well have to start at the very beginning. And the only worse thing than playing a disappointing title is being forced to play parts of a disappointing title multiple times over. Number 7. Duke Nukem Forever. We're diving back into the world of development hell again now to visit what is almost certainly the most infamous case of a title that escaped it but really never should have. The absolute mess that was Duke Nukem Forever. Over the course of around a decade and a half, the game was passed from developer to developer, director to director, and game engine to game engine, and was scrapped and restarted multiple times in order to try and stay as true to the original games as possible, while also keeping up with the changing technology. In the end, though, all those efforts were in vain, as no game could have possibly lived up to hype that was built up for that long, even if it had been good, which, spoiler alert, Duke Nukem Forever wasn't. The locations were boring, the visuals dull, and the whole thing was fraught with bugs and unnecessarily long loading times. In addition to that, thanks to the 15 years it spent languishing and morphing, the game's humour was incredibly outdated and often downright offensive, and made the game seem very much like a product of its time, and one that probably should have just stayed in its time. Sometimes, it's better to just leave well enough alone. Number 6. Haze. In the 2000s, referring to a game as a Halo killer was a pretty bold statement to make, as the massive Microsoft series was riding high at the time, and it would take something truly special in order to actually affect its great success. Unsurprisingly, few titles could hold a candle to these ambitions, but one that fell even shorter than most others was 2008's Haze. Expectations for this game were high, as it was being developed by Free Radical, the blokes behind the popular Time Splitters series, and the story seemed as though it could be a fresh take on the genre, with its mind-altering nectar hiding the horrors of what's actually happening and warping the player character's perception of the situation they're in. Once released, though, Haze ended up being less a Halo killer than a horrible mess, mainly thanks to the many issues the team faced during development, including battling with the notoriously hard-to-develop for PS3 hardware, being forced to include more and more features, and inexperienced producers mishandling the whole thing. As a result, many people were let down by the product they received, especially since it was from a well-regarded studio, as they found the game to be glitchy, uninspired, and visually unimpressive. Sadly, it couldn't compare with its contemporaries, especially not Halo, and as a result, it faded into obscurity pretty quickly. Number 5. Dead Space 3. The first two games in the Dead Space series are masterclasses in sci-fi survival horror, and the first one in particular is heralded as a classic of the genre. As such, when Dead Space 3 came along and was a complete letdown, the disappointment felt by gamers stung all the more. The thing is, Dead Space 3 isn't a terrible game, and many of the features that made the previous two titles popular were still in there, even if, as a whole, it did start leaning a bit more towards the action side of things. However, a key part of many horror experiences is that the player is living through the horrible situation all by themselves, with the sense of dread that comes from being isolated in the middle of all of those horrific goings-on being central to the experience. This is precisely where Dead Space 3 dropped the gore-covered ball, by adding a second player and a whole load of craftable guns, severely toning down the spook factor in the process. The comparatively low sales meant that the next planned sequel was scrapped, and it seemed as though the series was doomed to remain in the past until the recent remake, so maybe it's not the last we'll hear from these games after all. Various journalists reported in April of this year that a Dead Space 2 remake had been officially cancelled, but EA have since said that such a project was never in the works in the first place, which is not the same as saying it won't ever happen in the future, I guess. Number 4. Dino Crisis 3. Speaking of games that start with D and are third in their respective series, and also made their survival horror franchises too action-packed to please most of their audience, we now turn our attention to Dino Crisis. These comparatively obscure classics, which answer the question, what if Resident Evil but dinosaurs, may have been largely overshadowed by other titles at the time, but still had a significant fan base, and after the success of the first 2 numbered games, a third seemed to be a no-brainer. Unfortunately for fans though, Dino Crisis 3 was not the sequel that anyone wanted. To start with, it could barely be considered a sequel, as it was set 500 years in the future and in space, with no ties to the previous titles, meaning the cliffhanger from the second game was left completely unaddressed. On top of that, the space station setting meant the environments were boring and repetitive, the gameplay was criticized for being stuck in the past, and not in a good dinosaur-y way, and the horrible camera did nothing but hinder players, especially if they were trying to get around via jetpack. The horrible reception and sales of this follow-up have seemingly killed the series for good. But with the success of the recent Resident Evil remakes, people are holding out hope that when it comes to Dino Crisis, life might just find a way. Oh, sorry, that's the wrong dinosaur franchise. Number 3. Fallout 76. Fallout with friends sounds like it could be great, right? After all, Bethesda already fell upon a moneymaker with Elder Scrolls Online, so why not have a go at adding multiplayer to their other big RPG series too? However, as we all know, Fallout 76 came out and proved that sometimes things are better left as they are, and if you really do have to mess with them, at least keep the good parts in. Granted, the Fallout games may do a fair bit of the world building with terminals and grisly tableaus, but what makes them feel alive are the NPCs that populate the world, whether they be human, ghoul, or malevolent robot. However, at launch there were absolutely none to speak of, and even robots were fairly few and far between, making the game world feel completely lifeless and a boring place to explore. Add to that an egregious live service model, an incredible number of glitches, and tie-in products that were genuine health concerns, and suddenly the nuclear apocalypse doesn't seem like the worst thing that Fallout has to offer. Even though the game does at this point have a dedicated fanbase and has seemingly fixed the most glaring of its issues, including adding in NPCs, wow! It's still a title that many aren't likely to give a second chance. Number 2. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 5. By 2015, the Tony Hawk games had already had their fair share of poorly received titles, so when a new mainline game was announced, fans were hoping that it would give the series a chance to return to its previous fantastic form. Unfortunately, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 5 didn't just fail to meet expectations, but it somehow managed to dig an even deeper hole for itself than the previous installments. As the licensing deal was nearing its expiration date, the game had to be rushed in order to make it out of the door in time, causing a load of issues. Some of the major complaints that people had were that the levels were unoriginal and devoid of NPCs, there was next to no progression, and the bugs were plentiful. Perhaps one of the worst parts, though, was that there was next to nothing on the game disc itself, apart from a tutorial level and a park creator, which meant that a bulk of the game had to come from a day one patch, something that was, at the time, a rare occurrence. In fact, it was so bad that it ended up killing off the franchise for a good long while, and it wasn't until the Pro Skater 1 and 2 remaster released in 2020 that people were once again able to properly enjoy kick-flipping and pop-shoving and skateboarding is what I'm getting at there. And number 1, Cyberpunk 2077. I think it's pretty fair to say that CD Projekt Red's ambitious Cyberpunk 2077 was one of the most anticipated games in recent memory. And with the massive marketing push behind it, as well as expectations that were set sky high thanks to the fantastic Witcher 3, it seemed as though people's faith was well placed. As we all know now though, this all fell apart quite dramatically after launch, as it became glaringly obvious that the game was still nowhere near a finished product. The PC version of the game at least could be passable, as long as players' specs were good enough, but the console versions, especially those on the now previous gen hardware, suffered from just about every problem they possibly could. The plethora of glitches that plagued the game are infamous, but even more problematic was the fact that the game simply wouldn't run or even launch at times, and save files could corrupt worryingly easily. It even got so bad that the game was fully pulled from the Sony storefront for several months while the issues got addressed. Though the game has been significantly improved in the past few years, especially with the release of the Phantom Liberty DLC, which essentially overhauled the entire experience, there's no doubt that the initial launch and its myriad problems will go down in history for all of the wrong reasons.